The wedding dress hung in the window like a death shroud, and Colton Miles couldn't understand why everyone kept congratulating him. 3 days ago, he had been free. 3 days ago, Delilah Rhodes was just a name whispered in corners. Now she was his future wife, and no one would explain why that terrified them more than it should. Colton stood outside the general store watching people cross the street to avoid walking near him. Mrs. Henderson, who had known him since childhood, pulled her children closer when she saw him. Old Tom, who usually waved from his porch, disappeared inside his house. Even the dog seemed to sense something wrong, whimpering and backing away when he approached. Wade McKinley had made the announcement 3 days ago, standing in the center of town like he owned every soul in it. Which, Colton was beginning to realize, maybe he did. The debt his father left behind was substantial enough to bury a family for generations. McKinley owned that debt now, and apparently, he owned Colton with it. "You'll marry the widow Rhodes," McKinley had said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "Saturday morning. Consider it payment in full for your father's obligations." Colton had tried to speak, tried to protest, but McKinley's men were already moving closer. The message was clear. This wasn't a negotiation. When Colton looked around for support, for someone to say this couldn't be legal, he found only averted eyes and nervous shuffling. That's when he realized the first strange thing about this arrangement. Everyone was afraid, but not of McKinley. They were afraid of what he was being forced to do. "Why her?" Colton had managed to ask. McKinley's smile was cold as winter wind. "Because, boy, some debts require more than money to settle, and Delilah Rhodes has her own debts to pay." The way McKinley said her name made Colton's skin crawl. There was history there, something dark and unfinished. But when Colton pressed for details, McKinley just walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers. Now, standing in the morning sun with the wedding only hours away, Colton tried to piece together what little he knew about his intended bride. Delilah Rhodes had been married before, that much was common knowledge. Her husband had died under circumstances that nobody discussed openly. She lived alone in the house at the end of Maple Street, the one with the black shutters that were always closed. People said she never smiled, never spoke unless spoken to, and never, ever looked anyone directly in the eyes. But there was something else, something that made even the toughest men in town uncomfortable when her name came up. Colton had seen it in their faces when McKinley made the announcement. Fear, yes, but also something that looked almost like guilt. The church bell began to ring, calling him to his fate. As Colton walked toward the small chapel, he noticed something odd. For a woman everyone claimed to fear, Delilah Rhodes sure had a lot of people who refused to attend her wedding. The chapel was nearly empty when Colton arrived, confirming his growing suspicion that something was deeply wrong with this entire arrangement. Only Wade McKinley sat in the front pew, flanked by 2 of his men. The preacher, Reverend Hayes, kept checking his pocket watch and wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. Colton had expected to wait for his bride, but Delilah Rhodes was already there, standing at the altar with her back to the door. She wore a simple black dress instead of white, and her dark hair was pulled back so severely it looked painful. When she finally turned to face him, Colton felt his breath catch in his throat. She wasn't what he had expected at all. The woman everyone described as fearsome was actually quite beautiful, with sharp green eyes and delicate features. But there was something in her expression that made his chest tighten with unease. It wasn't anger or hatred as he'd anticipated. It was resignation, as if she was attending her own execution rather than her wedding. "You're younger than I thought," she said quietly as he approached the altar. Her voice carried a slight tremor that seemed to surprise even her. "And you're not what they said you were," Colton replied, studying her face for any sign of the monster the townspeople had made her out to be. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. It might have been amusement, or it might have been pain. "They never tell the truth about me, but they're about to get what they've wanted for a long time." Before Colton could ask what she meant, Reverend Hayes cleared his throat and began the ceremony. The words felt hollow in the empty chapel, echoing off the walls like accusations. When it came time for the vows, Delilah spoke them with mechanical precision, as if she'd rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. Colton found himself watching her carefully, trying to understand the contradiction before him. If she was so dangerous, why did she seem so defeated? And why was McKinley smiling like he'd just won the most important game of his life? "Do you, Colton Miles, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Hayes asked, his voice shaking slightly. Colton hesitated. Every instinct told him to run, not from Delilah, but from whatever trap was closing around them both. But the debt was real, and McKinley's men were real, and sometimes a man had no choice but to walk into the darkness and hope he could find his way out. "I do," he said. The moment the words left his lips, something changed in the chapel. McKinley's smile widened, Delilah's shoulders sagged as if she'd been carrying an enormous weight, and Reverend Hayes quickly finished the ceremony like he couldn't wait to be done with it. "You may kiss the bride," the Reverend said, but he was already backing away from the altar. As Colton leaned toward his new wife, Delilah whispered something so quietly only he could hear. "I'm sorry for what they're going to do to you." Before he could ask what she meant, the chapel door burst open, and 3 riders thundered up to the entrance, their faces grim with purpose. The 3 riders who burst through the chapel doors weren't strangers to Delilah Rhodes. Colton could tell by the way her entire body went rigid, like a deer that had just caught the scent of wolves. The leader, a weathered man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, dismounted slowly, his spurs clicking against the wooden floor with each deliberate step. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of getting exactly what he wanted. "Looks like we missed the ceremony, Delilah." McKinley rose from his pew, but for the first time since Colton had known him, the powerful man looked genuinely nervous. "Marcus, you weren't invited to this wedding, wasn't I?" Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving Delilah's face. "See, that's funny. Wade, because last I checked, my brother's widow still belonged to the Garrett family, and family business is always our business." The pieces began falling into place in Colton's mind. Marcus Garrett, he'd heard that name before, whispered in the same fearful tones as Delilah's. The Garrett brothers had controlled the cattle trade for 3 counties until something had happened to break their power. Something involving a dead brother and a widow who'd inherited more than anyone expected. "Your brother's been dead for 2 years, Marcus," McKinley said, his hand moving subtly toward his jacket. "His debts died with him." "Did they?" Marcus stepped closer to the altar, and Colton noticed his 2 companions had positioned themselves to block the exits. "Because from what I hear, that debt just got transferred to a new husband, isn't that right, boy?" Colton felt all eyes turn to him, but it was Delilah who spoke first. "Leave him out of this, Marcus. He doesn't know anything about the arrangement." "Arrangement?" Colton looked between his new wife and the men who clearly wanted to kill someone in this chapel. "What arrangement?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She didn't tell you. Your bride here has been sitting on something that belongs to my family, something my brother died trying to protect. And now that she's married again, well, that makes things interesting from a legal standpoint." Delilah's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "I told you 2 years ago, Marcus. I don't know where it is." "Maybe," Marcus said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "But your new husband might be more cooperative than you've been, especially when he learns what happens to people who keep secrets from the Garrett family." The paper he held looked official, covered in stamps and seals. Some kind of legal document that made McKinley's face go ashen. Colton was beginning to understand that this wedding wasn't about debt at all. It was about something far more dangerous, something that had gotten at least 1 man killed and was about to put him squarely in the crosshairs. "You have 24 hours, Marcus said, folding the paper and returning it to his coat. "Find what belongs to us, or your new marriage is going to be very short." As the 3 men filed out of the chapel, Delilah finally looked directly at Colton, and he saw something in her eyes that chilled him more than any threat. What Colton saw in Delilah's eyes wasn't fear or regret. It was pity. She pitied him, and that realization hit harder than any threat Marcus Garrett could have made. His new wife believed he was going to die because of her, and she'd already accepted it as inevitable. The chapel emptied quickly after the Garrett brothers left. Even Reverend Hayes muttered something about urgent business elsewhere and practically ran for the door. McKinley lingered for a moment, his earlier confidence completely gone, before following the others outside. Within minutes, Colton and Delilah stood alone in the small building that had just witnessed the strangest wedding ceremony in the town's history. "We need to talk," Delilah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But not here. These walls have ears and McKinley pays well for information." They walked in silence to her house at the end of Maple Street, the same house everyone avoided like it carried plague. Up close, Colton could see why it unsettled people. The black shutters weren't just closed. They were nailed shut from the inside. The front porch sagged under the weight of neglect, and weeds had grown tall enough to hide the lower windows. Inside, the house was surprisingly clean, but felt like a fortress. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, and Colton noticed that every window had thick wooden boards behind the glass. Someone had turned this place into a stronghold, built to keep the world out, or to keep something in. "Sit down," Delilah said, gesturing to a worn chair near the fireplace. "I need to tell you what you've gotten yourself into." For the next hour, Delilah spoke in careful, measured sentences, as if each word had been weighed and tested before she released it. Her first husband, Thomas Rhodes, had been more than just a rancher. He'd been McKinley's partner in a business venture that had gone very wrong very quickly. When Thomas died in what everyone called an accident, he'd left behind more than grief. He'd left behind evidence of something that could destroy McKinley's reputation, and possibly his life. The night before he died, Thomas hid a metal box somewhere in this house, Delilah explained. Inside that box are documents that prove McKinley has been stealing cattle from every rancher in 3 counties and selling them across the territorial border. Thomas was going to expose him. Colton leaned forward, his mind racing. "And McKinley thinks you know where the box is." "I've torn this house apart looking for it," Delilah said. "If it's here, Thomas hid it well, but McKinley doesn't believe me. He thinks marrying me to someone young and strong would either help him find it or give him legal claim to everything Thomas owned." Outside, the sound of approaching horses cut through the afternoon quiet. Delilah moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains, her face going white as fresh snow. "They're back," she whispered, "and this time, they brought shovels." The sound of metal striking earth came from the backyard, rhythmic and determined. Marcus Garrett and his men weren't wasting time with threats or negotiations. They were digging, and from the confident way they worked, they knew exactly where to look. Colton moved to join Delilah at the window, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The 3 men had already opened a hole near the old oak tree, dirt flying as they worked with the efficiency of experienced grave diggers. But it wasn't the digging that concerned him most. It was the 4th man who had joined them, sitting on horseback and watching the house with the patience of a hunter, waiting for prey to bolt. "They know something we don't," Delilah whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Thomas never mentioned anything about the yard. Colton studied the scene more carefully. The hole was positioned precisely between 2 specific fence posts, as if the location had been marked or measured beforehand. Either the Garrett brothers had been planning this excavation for months, or someone had given them very detailed information about where to dig. "Who else knew about the box?" Colton asked. "Only Thomas and—" Delilah's voice trailed off, and her face went pale. "Oh no. Mercy." "Who's Mercy?" "My friend. The only person in town who still talks to me." Delilah stepped back from the window, her hands shaking. "She helped me search the house last year when I was desperate. I told her everything about the box, about what Thomas had hidden." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Mercy Whitmore had been feeding information to the Garrett brothers, probably for months. Every conversation, every shared confidence, every desperate moment when Delilah had trusted someone with her secrets, had been reported back to Marcus Garrett. Outside, one of the diggers shouted something, and the others gathered around the hole with obvious excitement. They'd found something. "We have to go," Colton said, grabbing Delilah's arm. "Right now, before they finish whatever they're doing out there." But Delilah pulled away from him, her expression hardening with sudden resolve. "No, I'm tired of running from this. If they found what Thomas hid, then it's time to face whatever comes next." "You don't understand," Colton insisted. "If that box contains evidence against McKinley and the Garrett brothers get their hands on it, they'll use it to control him. That makes them more powerful than anyone in 3 counties. Then we better make sure they don't get to use it." Before Colton could stop her, Delilah was moving toward the back door, her hand reaching for something hidden behind the kitchen cabinet. When she turned back to face him, she was holding a rifle that looked well-maintained and frequently used. "What are you doing?" Colton demanded. "What I should have done 2 years ago," she replied, checking the rifle's ammunition with practiced efficiency. "Thomas died protecting those documents. The least I can do is make sure his death meant something." The shouting from the backyard was getting louder, more urgent. Whatever they'd found had exceeded their expectations. The metal box they pulled from the ground wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of the small container Delilah had described, the Garrett brothers had unearthed something the size of a coffin, heavy enough that it took all 3 men to lift it from the hole. Even from the kitchen window, Colton could see that whatever Thomas Rhodes had buried, it was far more significant than a collection of documents. "That's not the box Thomas told me about," Delilah said, lowering her rifle slightly. "This doesn't make sense." Marcus Garrett was examining the metal container with growing excitement, running his hands along its surface like he was greeting an old friend. When he found what he was looking for, a series of clasps along one side, his triumphant shout carried clearly through the afternoon air. 20 years, Marcus called out to his men. 20 years we've been looking for this. 20 years. That meant whatever was buried in Delilah's backyard had been there long before Thomas Rhodes owned the property, long before he'd ever met his future wife. The realization hit both Colton and Delilah at the same moment, changing everything they thought they understood about the situation. Thomas wasn't hiding evidence against McKinley, Delilah whispered. He was hiding something he found, something that belonged to the Garrett family. The metal container opened with a grinding screech that made everyone in the yard step back. Marcus Garrett reached inside and pulled out what looked like bundles wrapped in oiled cloth, each one carefully preserved despite decades underground. When he unwrapped the first bundle, even Colton could see the gleam of gold coins catching the sunlight. "Confederate gold," Delilah breathed. "Thomas found a cache of Confederate gold on our property." The implications were staggering. During the final months of the conflict, Confederate forces had buried treasure across the frontier, hoping to fund a resistance that never materialized. Most of these caches had been lost to history, their locations dying with the men who buried them. But Thomas Rhodes had somehow discovered one of the largest finds in the territory, and instead of reporting it, he'd kept the secret to himself. Marcus Garrett was loading the bundles into saddlebags with methodical efficiency, but his celebration was premature. The sound of approaching riders from the front of the house announced the arrival of new players in this deadly game. Through the front window, Colton could see McKinley and at least 6 armed men surrounding the property. "Garrett," McKinley's voice boomed across the yard. "Step away from that treasure. It's on my land now, which makes it mine by law." The standoff that followed was like watching two storms collide. Marcus Garrett and his men took cover behind the oak tree, their hands moving to their weapons. McKinley's group spread out across the front yard, creating a circle that would make escape impossible for anyone caught in the middle. "Your land?" Marcus shouted back. "This gold was buried by my grandfather 23 years ago. Find someone else to steal from, Wade." Delilah grabbed Colton's arm, her grip tight enough to leave marks. "We're trapped between them. When the shooting starts, neither side is going to worry about witnesses." As if to prove her point, the first gunshot rang out across the yard, though Colton couldn't tell which side had fired first. The war for Confederate gold had officially begun, and his new wife's house was the battlefield. The gunfight that erupted in Delilah's yard was unlike anything Colton had ever witnessed. McKinley's men had numbers, but the Garrett brothers had the advantage of cover behind the massive oak tree and its freshly dug hole. Bullets splintered fence posts and shattered windows as both sides fought for control of enough gold to buy half the territory. "The cellar!" Delilah shouted over the gunfire, pulling Colton toward a hidden door beneath the kitchen floorboards. "Thomas built it for storage, but it connects to the old mine shaft behind the house." They dropped into the cramped space, just as bullets began punching through the kitchen walls above them. The cellar was small and dark, but Delilah was right about the tunnel. A narrow passage led away from the house, carved through solid rock by miners who had worked this land decades before anyone dreamed of cattle ranches or buried treasure. "Where does it come out?" Colton asked, following her through the confined space. "About 50 yards behind the oak tree," she replied, "right where Marcus is making his stand." The tunnel was longer than it looked, and by the time they emerged from its hidden exit, the battle above had intensified. Through the screen of brush that concealed the tunnel mouth, Colton could see Marcus Garrett and his men pinned down behind the tree. Return fire keeping McKinley's larger force at bay. But it was obvious the Garrett brothers were running low on ammunition. What struck Colton as strange was how little attention either side was paying to the gold itself. The metal container sat open beside the oak tree, its precious contents spilling onto the ground. But both Marcus and McKinley seemed more interested in destroying each other than claiming the prize they were supposedly fighting over. "This isn't about the treasure," Colton realized. "This is personal." Delilah nodded grimly. "Thomas told me once that Marcus blamed McKinley for his brother's death. Said McKinley had promised protection during a cattle deal that went bad, then left Thomas's first husband to face a gang of thieves alone. The pieces of a 20-year vendetta were finally falling into place. The Confederate gold had simply provided the excuse for a confrontation that both men had been building toward for decades. McKinley had used Colton's forced marriage to claim legal right to search Delilah's property, but Marcus had been watching and waiting for exactly this opportunity. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the thunder of approaching horses from the main road. Someone else was coming to join this deadly game, and from the speed of their approach they weren't planning to negotiate. "The sheriff," Delilah said, recognizing the sound of multiple horses moving in formation. Someone in town must have heard the shooting. But when the riders appeared, Colton saw that his new wife was wrong. The men approaching weren't wearing badges. They were wearing the kind of trail clothes that suggested they'd been riding hard for many days, and their leader was scanning the battlefield with the calculating gaze of someone who knew exactly what was happening here. "Bounty hunters," Colton breathed. Someone put a price on that gold. The newcomers didn't hesitate. They spread out in a wide circle around the entire property, effectively trapping everyone inside a ring of professional gunmen who had no interest in old grudges or personal vendettas. They wanted the Confederate treasure, and they were prepared to kill anyone who stood in their way. Marcus Garrett saw them first and made a desperate decision that changed everything. Marcus Garrett's desperate decision was to grab as much gold as he could carry and make a run for the horses. But the bounty hunters were ready for exactly that move. The moment Marcus broke cover, rifle fire from 3 directions cut him down before he'd taken 5 steps. His men, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. McKinley tried to take advantage of the chaos, ordering his men to rush the oak tree and claim the treasure. It was a fatal mistake. The bounty hunters had no intention of sharing their prize with anyone, and McKinley's charge was met with a devastating volley that left half his men dead or wounded in the dirt. From their position in the tunnel entrance, Colton and Delilah watched the systematic execution of both sides with growing horror. The bounty hunters weren't interested in prisoners or negotiations. They were eliminating everyone who knew about the Confederate gold, ensuring they would be the only survivors to claim it. "They'll search the house next," Delilah whispered. "When they don't find us in the gunfight, they'll hunt us down." Colton was thinking furiously, trying to find a way out of a situation that seemed hopeless. Then he remembered something Delilah had said earlier about the tunnel system. If Thomas Rhodes had connected the cellar to an old mine shaft, there might be other passages, other ways to move unseen beneath the property. "The mine," he said suddenly. "How extensive is it?" "Thomas said it connected to 3 different properties," Delilah replied. "Why?" "Because those bounty hunters are about to learn that some treasures aren't worth the price you pay for them." Working quickly and quietly, Colton and Delilah made their way back through the tunnel to the cellar. From there, they found the mine shaft entrance Thomas had discovered, a narrow passage that led deeper underground. But instead of following it to escape, Colton began gathering everything flammable he could find in the cellar. Old newspapers, wooden crates, bottles of lamp oil. "What are you doing?" Delilah asked. "Creating a problem that's bigger than Confederate gold," Colton replied, soaking the wooden support beams with oil. "This mine runs under your entire property. If it collapses, it takes everything above it down too." Understanding dawned in Delilah's eyes, including the treasure, and anyone standing over it. They had just enough time to reach the far end of the mine system before Colton lit the fire. The flames spread faster than expected, racing along the oil-soaked wood and igniting pockets of methane gas that had accumulated over decades. The explosion that followed shook the ground for miles, collapsing not just the mine, but most of Delilah's property above it. When the dust settled, the oak tree, the treasure, and most of the bounty hunters had disappeared into a crater 50 feet wide. The few survivors limped away empty-handed, their horses spooked beyond recovery by the massive cave-in. 3 days later, Colton and Delilah stood at the edge of town with 2 horses and enough supplies for a long journey. The official story was that a gas explosion in an abandoned mine had killed everyone involved in an illegal treasure hunt. The sheriff seemed content to let the matter rest there, especially since all the troublemakers were now dead or gone. "Where do we go from here?" Delilah asked, looking at the horizon with something that might have been hope. "Anywhere but here," Colton replied, helping her mount her horse. "We're married now, for better or worse. Might as well see what better looks like." As they rode away from the town that had tried to destroy them both, Colton realized that sometimes the most unexpected marriages turn out to be exactly what both people needed. Delilah Rhodes had taught him that courage wasn't about facing death without fear. It was about choosing to build something new from the ashes of what others had tried to burn down. Behind them, the crater that had once been a backyard stood as a monument to the price of greed, but ahead of them lay a territory vast enough for two people who had learned that the most valuable treasure wasn't gold, but finding someone willing to face the darkness alongside you. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.